I started shooting film, I think maybe back in like 2019, kind of around that time, or I started shooting it properly. I'd kind of dabbled in film before, but never really fallen in love with it until I bought my Mamiya RZ67, which I do believe was kind of like the tail end of 2019. Since then, you know, I've really fallen in love with shooting film, with the process of shooting film. I think it's made me a better photographer. It's taught me to slow down. I think it's just generally kind of like opened my eyes to kind of a whole other side of photography that I kind of wasn't aware of or hadn't been exposed to. Forgive the photography pun. As a photographer, I'm completely self-taught. I've never been to school for photography. I'd never even taken a photography class or workshop until, you know, this video today. I've kind of learnt from YouTube, I've learnt from trial and error, a lot of expensive mistakes, most of which I've documented on this channel, and from assisting some really amazing photographers such as Alex Massick, who is actually the photographer who inspired me to take part in the first ever photography workshop that I've ever done. So as you guys will probably have worked out from the title of today's video is about my first ever attempt at hand printing my film. So Alex is a photographer who you might already know, especially if you do follow this channel, because he's featured on this channel a couple of times before. He's an amazing fashion photographer. If you haven't already seen his work, I will link him in the description. I'll also flash it up on screen. And he has recently, like in the last like 18 months or so, gotten into printing his film work. Alex prints his film at a darkroom in London called Rapid Eye. Some of you guys, if you're London based, you're probably going to be aware of Rapid Eye already. They're a lab and darkroom in Shoreditch. A few months back, Alex took me on a little tour of the darkroom and I signed up for the waiting list for their workshops. And yesterday I did my first workshop, hand printing some medium format negatives that I shot a couple of days back. Because I'm completely self-taught and I also didn't get into film photography until, you know, a couple of years ago, I have never been in a darkroom before. I've never developed my own film. I've never really done anything other than shoot my photos and occasionally scan my own photos. But I am really interested in kind of getting to learn and getting to understand the entire process of film photography. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the photos that I printed, my experience in the darkroom, and, you know, whether or not I will be going back. So the workshop at Rapid Eye that I took part in was led by an amazing photographer, George, who I'll also link in the description. What was amazing was it was a one-to-one workshop, so he was really able to take the time to show me around the darkroom, introduce me to all the different equipment, and give me a good understanding of what it was I was doing, showing me how to do it, letting me try how to do it, before letting me go off and do my own thing for a couple of hours. If you guys are London based or can get to London and you're interested in learning how to hand print, how to print in the darkroom, they do black and white and colour workshops. I'll link them in the description because I would definitely recommend to any photographer, any film photographer to do this. I think it's honestly one of the best things that I've ever done. You know, not just as a photographer, but like how therapeutic it was in terms of like my own mindfulness and my own hobby, I guess. I think when you work as a photographer, as well as it being your hobby, it can be difficult to kind of see definition between work and play. So doing something that was like solely just for me because I wanted to do it, not because, you know, maybe I had to do it because of a client, was really kind of like a nice therapeutic experience. But yeah, I'll get on to kind of how the process went. So we started off by creating some contact sheets from a shoot that I did the other day around Dalston. So this is the first contact sheet. So essentially what you do is you're exposing the negatives onto the paper and doing kind of like a strip test kind of thing, where you're testing different exposure times on one contact sheet to see kind of what works best. One of the things that really kind of confused me at first about like printing was the fact that things work kind of the opposite way around to photography. So when I saw this contact sheet, I kind of had assumed that these bottom ones had been exposed to light for longer, but actually it's the darker ones that have the longer exposure time. So the more your paper is exposed to light, the darker, the richer those colours are going to be. So this was the first contact sheet. And then we went through, you know, testing different exposures. Obviously this one, bit too dark, until we got to a contact sheet where I was kind of happy with the exposures for the images that I was going to print, which were going to be these two on this side here. What I'll do is I'll actually flash up the final prints and also the original scans that I got from Eye Culture in Bethnal Green, so you can see the difference between the straight scans from the lab and then the hand printed photos as well. Then this was my first kind of attempt at printing, again doing kind of like a strip test and working out what the best exposure was. This of course is way too light, so it took a little bit of time to kind of find the right exposure time. We ended up with this image, which was, you know, better with exposure, but there were tweaks that I wanted to make, not only to exposure but also to colours. I'm not going to show you kind of like every single one we did because there's quite a few and the tweaks are kind of minimal, so it's probably not that interesting to see every single one, but I will show you kind of when we got onto a exposure I was kind of happy with, which is around here. So this exposure was a little bit warmer and, you know, better in terms of the actual exposure, the actual brightness of the image. But what I noticed was, you know, the exposure wasn't perfect. It was a little bit blown out on the highlights here in the head and also by this wall, but the shadows around the model's neck were quite dark. So I didn't really want to go, you know, too dark to kind of lose those details in the neck, but I didn't want to go any brighter to blow out those highlights. So that's when George explained to me about pre-flash, where you essentially flash the paper at a shorter exposure beforehand, and it can help to kind of like smooth out those differences, and can be good for kind of smoothing out skin. So you flash the paper once with your hand over it. I don't know if you can see my handprint here, and then you take your hand off and do the normal flash, and then that creates the definition between something with the pre-flash and something without the pre-flash, so you can kind of see what it looks like and how you like it. Then we did the final kind of image with the pre-flash, which was this. And then using those same settings, I printed another negative here, and then had a little bit of time to be able to tweak those colours a little bit. So this is what we ended up with. I'll put all of that properly on screen so you can see, because I know, you know, there's lights reflecting and stuff like that. But it was a really interesting process for me to get my head around and to try, and I don't think that my first results were too bad. I'm really looking forward to getting back into the darkroom, tweaking a little bit more and playing around with kind of finding the perfect way in which I want to print. I think what's interesting is that film photography definitely made me a more considered photographer. You have to be more selective with what you're taking photos of because it costs money. I think, you know, darkroom printing will only further that for me in terms of being selective, because whilst ordinarily I might, you know, edit on Lightroom, whatever, like all of the images that I've taken in a shoot, maybe not all, but you know what I mean, like the vast majority. With printing, you don't have that much time. So you have to be really selective with what you think are your best photos and what you think are going to be the photos that you really want to develop from. But I think this process is really interesting because it teaches you again to slow down. And also, I know this sounds really stupid, but as someone who had never been in a darkroom, I didn't know how dark darkrooms were. Like, getting used to like doing everything in the dark was weirdly peaceful, but also a very strange experience. I think this video is, you know, just more me documenting my process at this point. Hand printing is something that I definitely want to do more of, so hopefully I'm going to make more videos on the channel about hand printing as I get into it. But this, I guess, is a starting point. This is my first time hand printing and I'm really happy with the results. I'm really happy with how much I enjoyed the process. Hopefully I'm able to continue in that vein. I'm going to link everyone that I spoke about in this video in the description, but a massive thank you to Alex for inspiring me to get into the darkroom and to George for teaching me. But thank you guys for watching and for listening to me ramble as ever, but I will see you guys in the next one.